So Dr. Kaberi Dasgupta is the chair this afternoon. She is a physician and a researcher as well as professor of medicine at McGill University. She's also the director of the Center for Outcomes Research and Evaluation at the Research Institute of the McGill University Health Center. And Dr. Dasgupta's studies focus on the prevention and management of diabetes and its related complications. In collaboration with her multidisciplinary team, including patient partners, she develops and tests strategies to enhance self-management report, and that makes her an ideal chair for one of the sessions of this workshop. So, Kaberi, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, and it's really a pleasure to be here in such scholarly company and such thinking company. So, you know, it's I really enjoyed reading the abstracts of the two presenters. So I guess, Thomas, I'll just introduce the first presenter and then the second one after. So it's a pleasure to introduce Antoine Lentacker, who is an assistant professor of history at University of California, Riverside. And he studies the intersection of the history of medicine, media, and law. And so now it looks like he's delving into social media in a way as well. And he is going to talk to us on a transformation of web-based, transformation of the reporting of side effects and capture of adverse effects through web-based pharmacovigilance. And I noticed a couple of titles of the various papers he's published: Prescription and Performance at the Turn of the Century in France, Drug Fetish, Capitalism, the Mass Press, the Body of the Worker in Austrian Socialism, and the Symbolic Economy of Drugs. So I know we're going to be through an intellectual journey here. Thank you very much, Antoine.
Great, thank you so much for the kind introduction. Yes, I should say perhaps that as a historian, most of my work is actually on the 19th century, on media and medicine in the 19th century Europe for the most part. And so I've been at work on a book on how industrial print media transformed the dispensation of drugs and information about drugs at that time. So, but as I write about media and medicine in the 19th century, obviously, the consequences of the internet, of our own present media revolution, on the circulation of drugs and information about drugs is never far from my mind. And so, as far as I can tell, I think the scholarship is focused on two different models or two different ways in which digital technologies have been shaping the circulation of drugs and information about drugs, and also more broadly, medical beliefs and practices. And so the first of these models, at least chronologically, I think, is the forum model, right? I mean, the open forum or discussion boards in which sufferers of the same condition, for instance, can come and form virtual communities, form virtual communities of support and information exchange. And then another model, probably a bit more recent, is the mining model, right? I mean, the big data model of algorithmic mining of large sets of electronic health data, personal data that are collected, with or without users' consent. And that often happens, perhaps not so much through the web as through wearable app-based devices. But I think an interesting insight in the recent scholarship on media and medicine and social media and medicine is that these two models, which may seem, to some degree are opposed, and often the forum model is more a patient-based or patient-powered model. The other one is, these apps are typically owned by for-profit companies. To some degrees, they're converging in practice, mostly because for-profit data brokers exploit the rhetoric of openness, participation, and empowerment, which first emerged on patient-powered networks, but to persuade users to surrender their data, to get users to share their data that they then harvest and transform into their, becomes capital for them. And so, in consequence, you might say that the economy of airing and sharing increasingly converges with the extractive economy of collection, data collection, and commodification. And so for these reasons, I became interested in one project that to me doesn't really fit in either one of these two models. So let me share my screen at this point. Good. So this was my title slide, and okay. So this is the homepage. What the homepage of the website looks like. The website is called risk.org. So risk with a little bit of a pun that I cannot quite pronounce. But and so the website was launched in 2012. It was created by 3 scholars. 2 of them are also clinicians. And so one of them is David Healy, whose name is certainly going to be familiar to folks who study the pharmaceutical industry. Another one is a professor of family medicine in New Zealand. Her name is Dee Mangan, and then an anthropologist based in the US, whose name is Kalman Applebaum. And so the main purpose of the website is to bring side effects of drugs to light by getting patients to report them, by getting patients to report about the side effects they are experiencing with the medications they're taking. And then also actually to use those reports to rescript the dynamics of the patient-physician encounter, of the clinical relation. And so that's perhaps the clearest difference with the 2 other models I mentioned. I mean, risk relies on the web, not so much as a substitute for the clinical encounter, but instead as a way to revive it or move the bonds of what can be seen and sensed when a physician and patients meets. And so probably I should have a good name for the model it represents as well. I am still looking for it at this point. So what I'll do is I'll try to just, as an introduction to our conversation, to describe the website for you in 2 ways. First, by telling you the longer history of how the project came together. And that will, I will go back a couple decades. And then briefly also by discussing the website itself or its main functionalities. And so that way I'll hope to convey, to you some sense of the way it fits or perhaps doesn't quite fit in the modern landscape of digital health. Okay, so the roots of the risk project are really in the decade-long struggle to obtain recognition for one particular side effect, which is the ability of drugs like Prozac, Zoloft, Paxil, the family of drugs known as the SSRIs, to trigger suicidal or violent behavior in some patients, in a small subset of patients. And that story goes back all the way to the early 1990s. And I think the timing is interesting. It's important because the early 1990s, which is the time when SSRIs are introduced, they come on the market. In those years, Prozac, the first one in the late 80s, and then the other ones, the first years of the 1990s. These are also the years of the beginnings of the open web. And then there are also the years of the beginning of the evidence-based medicine movement. Movement, I'm not sure that it's quite possible to describe it, but at least the phrase evidence-based medicine is coined in those years. It's coined actually by a team of Canadian physicians, academic physicians at McMaster University. This is one of their articles that brings this phrase into circulation. And now the question of how or how much evidence-based medicine changes actual clinical practice is certainly a question of debate and controversy. But one thing evidence-based medicine certainly does is to provide a new language, a new normative language about the varieties of clinical evidence, about the kinds of evidence, names these kinds of evidence and classifies them, sorts, ranks them. And so some of that language that is being introduced in those years is, for instance, the idea of the hierarchy of evidence, right? That all the way at the top of the hierarchy of evidence, the most reliable kinds of evidence about clinical interventions are randomized controlled trials and meta-analysis thereof. So they get called the gold standard of clinical evidence. And then all the way at the bottom of the hierarchy of evidence is the so-called a case report, the single clinical case report about a single clinical case, right, or series thereof. And so a related notion to a related concept, the word is not new, but perhaps its meaning is new. The way it's used is the concept of the anecdote or the anecdotal. And the word anecdote etymologically means, that which is unpublished, which is not published, which I think is interesting. And then it also means two things. It means on the one hand, you see the dictionary definitions here. It lumps together the meaning of the single or singular case, the real event or incident, as it's put here in the dictionary, and also the meaning of hearsay, of that which is unreliable. Okay, and that these two meanings get merged together is in itself revealing, and that happens as sort of within the sort of new epistemology that's articulated in evidence-based medicine. So it kind of casts the single clinical case, which used to be the stuff from which medical knowledge was produced, cast it as sort of essentially inscrutable. And what the case of the SSRIs really, illustrates is how skillfully the drug companies were able to, appropriate or co-opt that language to defend their products against reports of harm, of side effects, especially those side effects that were initially detected in clinical trials. And in fact, it's quite common that serious side effects do not get detected in clinical trials, because the kind of clinical trials conducted to get drugs approved usually do not enroll enough patients to produce statistically relevant data about rare events, and some serious adverse events are quite rare. They can occur in fewer than 1 in 1,000 or 10,000 patients. And so in that case, usually clinical trials do not produce robust evidence. And so then, the evidence of these side effects always emerges in, some variety of the anecdotal, right? I mean, in the case of SSRIs, the connection between SSRI and the increased risk of suicide or suicidal behavior came from 3 different kinds of sources. The first was a clinical report. Doctors who had patients who became suicidal suspected the drugs and published their observations. And the first of these reports appeared in 1990. Then the second kind of evidence was reports by physicians filed with the FDA and other regulatory agencies through reporting systems for side effects. And so by 1991, the FDA, for instance, had about 800 reports of filed by doctors who suspected or at least observed that some of their patients had become suicidal while taking these drugs. Well, at the time, 1991, it would only have been Prozac, and then the other drugs appear right at that time as well. And then the last source of evidence were lawsuits. People, especially relatives of people who had died as a result of a suicide, or even in some cases acts of violence, even murders, committed, by people who were on those drugs, sue the drug companies, sue for compensation or damages. And in all these cases, the drug companies put forward the same defense, which is that, all these cases of suicide or violence are very unfortunate, they're regrettable, but they're just stories. They're mere anecdotes. And so nothing really proves that, it may just be a coincidence and not causality, because the only way to prove causality is through controlled clinical trials. And we've run these trials that have been, reviewed by the FDA and other drug agencies. They haven't shown any connection between increased suicidality or increased risk of suicide in our drugs. So really, we have to assume that, it was coincidence. And in fact, I mean, these drugs were prescribed to depressed people, not exclusively, but, among others, to people with depression who are at a greater risk of committing suicide to begin with. And so, the drug companies just, said very probably it was the disease getting worse and not the treatments that caused these people to commit suicide. So, our drugs cannot be held responsible for this. And this works quite well, right? I mean, so here's, for instance, a trial transcript, excerpt of a trial transcript in which, a witness for SmithKline Beecham, which produces a Paxil, which is one of the these SSRIs says, right? It's impossible on an individual basis from individual reports to ever assess a question of causality. So it's using this argument of the inscrutability of the single clinical case to defend the product. And so this works quite well, right? I mean, the FDA declines to add warnings, agrees with the drug company's argument. And in court too, it works. I mean, for at least the first 10 years or so, drug companies are not held liable. I mean, the verdicts go their ways. But the court cases were still very important because, I mean, most got settled out of court, but some go to trial. And at trial, lawyers had to do two things if they were going to win these cases. So first, they have to explain why, if the effect as read, it doesn't show up in the trials, or at least the published trials. And then they also have to vindicate the case report, so to speak, right? To outline the conditions under which case-specific evidence is, in fact, does provide reliable evidence of causation in a single case. And so to do that, the law firms recruited experts, and David Healy ended up being one of these experts. And he testified actually in the second and third of these SSRI cases that advanced to trial. One was a Prozac case in 1999. The trial was in 1999, and then the Paxil case, which was in 2001. And so first, in his capacity as a witness, he had access to all the documents that law firms obtained in discovery, all these internal company records. And so for one thing, the company records did show that the drug companies were well aware of the issue, of the side effects, and had taken active step to try to dissimulate it in their clinical trials. So by very carefully screening patients that could be at risk of suicide, then also by withholding unfavorable trial data and publishing the more favorable ones, then also by placing ghost-written articles. I mean, all those techniques that drug companies still rely on to produce a scientific record that's based, biased in favor of the benefits of the drugs, and it kind of dissimulates or at least downplays their risks. But then the second thing he had to do as a witness, which is perhaps the more relevant to my story, is to testify to the value of case-specific evidence, of what would be called anecdotal evidence, I guess, within the hierarchy of evidence. And so the two trials in which he testified were quite similar in that respect, and both of them involved men who were sort of in their 60s, had been, were fathers, married men with fathers, grandfathers, and had led pretty, ordinary, tranquil, middle-class existences until they were given an SSRI for, some milder mood disorder, and then within days of being put on the drug, commit these horrible crimes. I mean, they, in the first case, sort of the man killed his wife. In the second case, he killed his wife, daughter, and granddaughter. So, truly gruesome stuff, which really couldn't be comprehended. It was completely out of character for anyone who knew these people, and couldn't be comprehended if you didn't assume that the drug had something to do with it, right? So to Healy, at least, these were perfect examples of cases in which, in fact, the anecdotal evidence was perhaps the most reliable, or was at least reliable, compelling evidence that the drugs were, to blame, right? That the best evidence came from the specifics of the individual story. And so in the first case, the jury wasn't persuaded. In the second case, it actually was. In 2001, in a trial that happened in Wyoming, the jury returned a verdict in favor of the plaintiffs, and it was the first time that a drug company was held liable for a psychiatric side effect of one of their drugs. So the link between these court cases and the RISK project was actually through a TV program and a bunch of emails. So in 2002, a year after the verdict in the Wyoming case, the BBC aired a TV program that was called Secrets of Seroxat, and Seroxat is the trade name of Paxil, of paroxetine. Paxil is the US trade name, but it's the same drug. And so the TV documentary consisted mostly of interviews with patients who were taking these drugs, and Seroxat was the best-selling antidepressant in Britain at the time. SmithKline is a British company, and so they also interviewed Healy, who had testified in the Wyoming case. They told the story of the Wyoming case, and And, somewhat to the surprise of pretty much everyone involved, the program ended up generating the largest or greatest response of any broadcast in the BBC's history. I mean, tens of thousands of viewers called in, mostly to talk about their own troubles with the drug. And so one consequence of the outcry was that the MHRA, which is the British FDA, the UK drug regulatory agency, was forced to revisit the issue, take another hard look at the issue of the safety of SSRIs. And in this review, the evidence, the kind of more damaging trial data or safety data that the companies had tried to withhold was eventually discovered, or the companies felt, GSK felt compelled to come forward and release that data. And so the MHRA in 2003 and other drug agencies later on eventually recognized that the drugs can in fact cause that side effect. And that was about more than 12 years after it had initially been described in the medical literature in case reports. And so the thing then is also that the SSRI story was followed by other similar, I don't know what I should call them, scandals or damaging revelations about the side effects of, there was the Vioxx story and Zyprexa and Neurontin and all these cases of drugs that were blockbuster drugs sold to millions of people, had been tested in trials. The trials had been reviewed by the regulatory agencies, and only after years of being prescribed to millions of patients, then suddenly these side effects were revealed, right? And so the mid-2000s, as a result, was a period of it was this intense, or the drug companies really came in, and drug regulation systems too came in for this harsh reckoning. And it was also the time in which really most of our critical literature on the pharmaceutical industry really developed, sort of the latter half of the 2000s, the first decade of the 21st century. And it was in that context, sort of around conferences in this time of intense scholarly activity around the drug industry, that Healy met Dee Mangan and Kalman Applebaum, who were the two other co-founders of the RISC project. And so one thing that all three of them agreed on was that, our collective blindness to the harms of drugs comes, at least in part, from the shift to data-intensive practices, beginning with clinical trials, right? And the shift away from intuitive medicine, as Dr. Rosenberg called it. And so as a result, a solution shouldn't come only, at least, from bigger data or better informatic, like epidemiological tools or models, but would also have to involve kind of rethinking of the role of and the place of the so-called anecdotes in the generation of clinical knowledge, or pharmaceutical knowledge especially. And so the role that the internet might play in this was, in fact, or also came into view right after the BBC's program, The Secrets of Seroxat program. 2002, so the year it aired, it was still very early in the internet era. So at the time, most of the viewers who wanted to react to the program picked up their phone. 65,000 people picked up their phone, called the BBC. But then another group of people decided to email the BBC instead. And that was about 1,500 emails were sent to the broadcaster. And so having received these emails, the BBC gave them to two scholars to be analyzed. And one was a London-based independent policy analyst. His name was Charles Medawar. And the other one was an Oxford pharmacologist named Andrew Herxheimer. And so the two of them assessed this set of 1,500 emails. And they really viewed it as a one-of-a-kind archive, because before the internet, reports of side effects from patients were really quite rare. All the reports typically were filed by doctors, and most pharmacovigilance schemes even didn't allow patients to submit reports of side effects. They had to only reports from side effects were accepted only from physicians, right? So through these forms, this is the FDA's form, the MedWatch system that the physician has to fill out. This is the yellow card scheme, which is the name given to this reporting system for physicians in the UK. And so this is what the MHRA said of its justification for not allowing patients to submit reports side effects. And so it said that it does not accept reports directly from patients because we considered that the medical interpretation of the reaction is vital. But then, for Herxheimer and Medawar, once they had these emails, they could also request from the MHRA similar or reports of the same side effect. So mostly side effects of people who had become suicidal taking SSRIs, or who had withdrawal reactions was the other big side effect that Secrets of Sirach talked about. And so they could compare them. They could compare the way that patients report side effects and the way that doctors report side effects. And so they published a couple papers on this in 2002 and 2003 that really laid bare the differences between a patient's way of reporting a side effect and a doctor's way of doing so. And basically, listed all the ways in which the system of delegated reporting, in which all the reporting is done by professionals, undermines the recognition of adverse drug reactions. So for one thing, all the reports were very short, the reports submitted by doctors. Even the ones that report cases of suicide or suicide attempts were 75 words long on average. And for one thing, because they systematically omit all the detail, the kind of narrative detail, the color that typically was found in the emails when patients report on the side effects. And all this detail is, according to Medawar and Herxheimer, at least, and I quote them here, is where you see the real dimensions of an adverse drug reaction, or what the side effects actually mean in the context of personal and social life to the patients. And so the system of delegated reporting, and that's another quote in that system, the patient's report is filtered through the doctor's own expectations and his or her interpretation of what is credible, serious, and worth reporting. And that way, what gets recorded in the end is only, and that's another quote, a translation into medical shorthand of what the patient says. And that translation of patients' accounts into standard medical language makes sense from the viewpoint of kind of traditional pharmacovigilance, because the point of getting these reports is to kind of abstract out of the patient story is kind of encoded keywords that can then be easily retrieved if you process, you kind of machine process the database you look for, a very large number of accounts. You want to have the keywords in the report so you can kind of retrieve them that way. So it serves the purpose of kind of quantitative processing of the reports, but it also flattens the account. It kind of strips it of its narrative texture and undermines its value for a kind of more immersive, close reading of the account, which is precisely what Medawar and Herxheimer advocated. And so in interviews I had with Healy, he definitely acknowledged Medawar and Herxheimer's work as kind of as an inspiration for the RISC project. And in fact, Medawar and Herxheimer already in 2002 did note in their papers how the internet might be a way to transform pharmacovigilance, because it opens this avenue for patients to report, to collect reports directly from patients as opposed to from physicians. And so in some way, the RISC project is an attempt to realize that vision. And so instead of relying on emails, if you go on the website, you report your side effect by, okay, I don't see my cursor, but here on the lower right side of the screen, are you experiencing a side effect? If you click on that directly, it takes you to this online form. And that's what it looks like. That's just one section of the form. You can see the title of the different sections here on the top. And so you provide here in that particular box, you provide your narrative account of your reaction, which is typically what patients would have done in these emails that Medawar and Herxheimer looked at. But here it also comes in this form that ensures that the patients, would also provide, or the form solicits all the key information about the name of the drug, the dosage, the diagnosis, duration of treatment, if it was interrupted, if there's any, co-administration of drugs, like other drugs, etc. And it also attaches all the metadata that's needed to archive the report and retrieve it at a later date. So the point of the form is not to replace the narrative account, but it's kind of to frame it or inform it in that way. And I should say that in some way, the report looks, or the online form looks quite similar to the forms that you find on websites like the FDA or the MHRAs now. And actually, since the the fallout of the SSRI and Vioxx and other sort of side effects scandals like that, more and more drug regulators have opened up their databases to online reporting for patients, right? So now you can submit a report online to the MHRA or the FDA. But it's still quite different from the way that risk does it. So for one thing, the regulatory agencies continue to encourage like professional reporting. They remain biased to it, and so they don't. I mean, they accept report from patients, but they don't take any active steps to really encourage them. So in the FDA website, for instance, you have to click through 5 different. You have to click 5 times from the homepage. Last time I checked to get to this page here, and so as the layout of the page shows you, in fact, the consumer reporting system is one that's basically grafted onto the professional system, and the reports from professionals and patients go into the same location, and they're processed in the same way through this sort of, quantitative processing or mining for, kind of signal generation is what it is called, right? So that's one clear difference with risk. And risk gets far fewer reports. It gets a few thousand every year, so that means it's smaller by orders of magnitude than what the FDA receives, for instance, but it only receives reports from patients and then uses them differently. I mean, it uses them more for this, immersive, close reading. So, okay, so one, sorry, am I going over time here a little bit?
It's just that it's so fantastic, we won't have enough time for discussion.
Okay, that's okay. I have one more point that hopefully will come up in the it will come up in the conversation. So I can definitely stop here. Thanks for your patience.
So maybe Antoine, if you want to stop sharing, and I guess we'll go to gallery view.
Because my cursor for some reason is not showing. So okay. Oh, good. Okay, I have it.
There we go. And I think Vivian Hamilton has a question for you.
Yes, thank you. That was just such a fascinating story about, this whole circumstance and this new method of making a kind of evidence more legible and sort of visible. And as you were telling us this story, it made me think about the fight for environmental justice and the way, fence line communities, people who are living in an environment that's slowly becoming poisoned, also really struggle to make their own lived experience of that and their expert witnessing of that, legitimate. So I guess that's just sort of an observation. And then the question would be, as I was thinking about the similarities between those two cases, we don't often think of those communities really as consumers, the way we're thinking of the patient as consumer. Often they don't have a lot of choice. People don't choose to necessarily live in a location where a chemical plant shows up. So I guess my question for you is, to what extent the patients in your story see themselves as active consumers who have either chosen a particular drug or chosen drugs at all, or whether they see themselves more as, I suppose, maybe victims of prescribing.
Yes, so the patients that we know a little bit more about, and I know about them somewhat indirectly. I mean, I've spoken with or interviewed the folks who manage the website, but there are also those patients who will not just submit a report, but also the website as a blog, for instance, or they reach out directly to the sort of the staff of the team of the website, and so they are typically these, I suppose, or are more likely perhaps to be these more, enterprising or curious patients. Often the story they tell, however, is one in which, they've gone to their doctor. So there's one very interesting case. One of the side effects that has been highlighted on the website, it's not one recognized, at least yet, by regulators, or is not in fact described in the literature until a paper was written about it based on the risk database, but is alcohol craving associated with SSRI use. And it really came from one story of one patient who was a middle-aged woman, apparently from the south of England, and she, I think the story was that her father had died when she was in her 30s, and it was a difficult time. So at the funeral, she has this kind of panic attack and cannot swallow anymore, has a hard time swallowing food, and so she's given an SSRI. She's given Paxil, Seroxat, and then gradually she drinks more and more, and her friends bring it to her attention. She never connects it to the drug right away, and then she talked to her doctor, and that's often the story told. The doctor said, no, actually we give these drugs to people who have alcoholism issues, and so he kind of brushes her off, and she keeps like researching it and online, and then to some degree she presses her physician to change the prescription. He resists at first, and then in the end he gives a different antidepressant that's not a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, that acts on a different neurochemical. I don't know which, I don't remember which the drug was, and then the problem suddenly clears up. I mean, in the meantime, she had like lost her job, and she got in trouble, and she got in court because she kept making these calls to the police every night, and when she was drunk. I mean, so it was a bad story for her, but she definitely tells that story, how she at the beginning she was given this antidepressant, didn't question it, trusted her doctor, and only as her issues arise does she look for it more and more, and keeps pressing her doctor. And then later on she takes on this active role within the relationship. So that's definitely one of the stories that has emerged on the website.
Great. Chris, did you want to, you had a question, Chris Rudin?
Yeah, thank you for this very interesting presentation. And I found both the presentation and the paper very interesting and generative. And I think my question is in regards to the case study. I think the case study of SSRIs is very interesting. And it got me thinking about what I've read about them, and thinking about how narrative was in fact in case study was actually pretty prominent in like the 90s case of the SSRIs. Thinking of listening to Prozac, of Prozac Nation, where of course listening to Prozac is Peter Kramer, a physician, kind of saying his understanding of what he's seeing in his patients, but the cases of Mrs. Prozac that come from that become extremely popular, and then you get things like Prozac Nation written by someone who's taking the drug themselves. So my question in kind of regards to that is, how much is this in between kind of case you're describing? How much is this kind of shift in epistemology and perhaps connected with this particular class of drugs, and especially the way narrative and the way case studies are tied into that?
Yes. Okay, so that's a very good point. I didn't make it clear, but it should be clear that there's many different kinds of side effects, and not all of them are. Different methods are, more suitable for different kinds of side effects. And obviously, the risk model is one in which, is for those side effects that patients can experience and can to some degree experience as side effects and are likely to report on. Some side effects, it just doesn't work that way, right? I mean, the Vioxx thing, for instance, people got heart attack after taking a pain medication. It's not something that they experience or as a side effect to the same degree. I guess SSRIs, especially, psychotropic drugs in general, are more, sort of more likely perhaps to generate these side effects that can be noticed as side effects and can affect the sort of, self-experience of the patient. So yes, and SSRIs, I think, is very much the case. And even, I mean, the website risk is supposedly for all drugs, but actually a lot of reporting, and also because of the history out of which it comes, right? But a lot of reporting and conversation remains about SSRIs and the particular side effects that have been highlighted in papers that were written based on the risk database are about SSRIs. So the alcohol issue that I mentioned, also the effects of SSRIs on sexual function and sort of sexual well-being has also been a big topic of concern on the website. So yes, it's still very much tied to SSRIs. And I think, and you're right, I mean, already at the time, and Peter Kramer is interesting. case. But I guess like the book he publishes also connected more, I guess, to a broader conversation in the media about SSRIs and these other popular books. And I mean, I don't know, there were shows made on it. I mean, The Sopranos is later on, but there's a whole show about, SSRIs and their side effects as well, right? So, and so it is true that there was this interest, and coming from patients too, to talk about SSRIs. But interestingly, it was used within the medical community as an argument against the use of this anecdotal evidence, right? Saying like, oh, patients are talking about this because they're hearing about it in the media, and it's not really coming from their own experience. And so this discourse is generated in the media, and therefore, the responsible thing to do as a scientist is to, set that aside and not listen to it, and instead just look at the data, which meant the clinical trial data. So it plays out in sort of interesting way already in the 90s. I mean, you're absolutely right about that. So.
I think we have time for one more question from Thomas.
Okay, yeah. Also in relationship to Vivian's question about the consumer, where's the consumer here? And so I think the common theme here is probably agency of the patient, the user, the consumer. So it's a different kind of agency. If it's a consumer, the agency is choice. This is less the case here. It's more about producing evidence. And in both cases, it's about a technology, if we call a drug a technology, but it's also mediated by a technology, made possible, shaped by a technology, various technologies that you have actually discussed in detail, because a lot is dependent on the exact format of these mediating technologies. What kind of website is it? How is it pre-structured? So we can study the agency, the patient's agency, and how this is linked up to what the technology, the mediating technology looks like in this case. And that makes it then a contribution to our general theme. Maybe we can discuss that later on at the end, broaden the theme actually to go beyond patient consumer and talk more about agency of different kinds and of different, which puts people in different roles as a patient or a consumer or an informant. So just as a comment.
Yes, and I think an interesting idea behind it that inspires the risk project is, that it doesn't, or to some degree, it relies on the idea of the patient who will try to figure out for themselves what their problem is. And one of the slogans is kind of funny on the website is like, if you think you are a problem, you're probably right. But then, so it has this vision of the person who will go to their computer and look for things on the internet and bring it to their doctor. But so for one thing, it's not just about generating information that's then stored in the database and looked at by doctors, but also actually when you file your reports on risk, you get a report back, and your report is given a risk score, which is kind of a preliminary assessment based on some sort of basic algorithm that just gives you a score of how likely it is that your issue is linked to the drug. And then it actually encourages you to print your report and bring it to your doctor. So it kind of has this vision of, and actually, I had a quote on the slide of, the concern is often when patients present themselves in front of their doctor, or they may bring up complaints that they have with their drugs, but the doctors are often likely to brush them off and say, no, that's not one of the side effects of the drug. It's probably your condition. And so that patients kind of, become shy about insisting with their doctor too much. And so the idea is that if you have a printed report and you present it to your doctor and, it could initiate a conversation, it could be one way that, the reporting online becomes a tool not to replace the clinical relationship, but to somehow, rescript it or equalize the power relation between the patient and the doctor. So it thinks about agency also in this relational way, right? I mean, it's not agency in the sense that the patient does it all for themselves and can make it happen without the help of the doctor, but on the contrary, it's trying to transform or reconfigure the relationship between the patient and and the clinician, because the vision is to some degree that, still the clinical relationship, and the doctor is truly open to, what happens before his or her eyes, and is not overly influenced by, whatever is published about clinical trials. He or she is going to be the source of knowledge about drugs, right? So it kind of has like almost this conservative, or I don't know, or it's very much about what gets lost in the era of big data and what has to be recovered from, from intuitive medicine. So it doesn't reject like clinical trials, I think, but, kind of advocates for a more pluralistic kind of epistemology of some kind of way to, salvage the kind of, case report and clinical relationships. So
I think we're going to have to go on. There's some really good comments coming in, but maybe at the end of the next session, we can come back to them.
yeah, sorry.